Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Daraja Press. And today we're going to be talking about this extraordinary book, Transforming Our Lives, Transforming the World. We live in an age where unprecedented numbers of people have joined organizations and involved themselves in social action. Yet, as Brian Murphy, the author of this book, points out, many of us are pessimistic when confronted by the powerful forces of big corporations and big government about our ability to change the world. This book, I think, is for all those who are engaged in that kind of work. Community workers, adult educators, social activists of every kind who want to overcome that pessimism and play a part in changing society in the direction of peace, justice, and dignity for all human beings. Brian explains in this book the social and personal dilemmas which hold people back from social engagement, but, he argues, the various constraints we face can be overcome. Welcome, Brian. I'm sure many of you already know Brian Murphy, who's an independent analyst, organizer, educator, and writer, and has been a long-standing member of staff until his retirement in 2006 with the Canadian International Social Justice Organization, Inter Pares. But in spite of retiring, Brian continues to be incredibly active, including being an active member of the steering committee of the Ottawa-based International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, which he helped to create in 2002. And in this new edition, David Austin explains in his introduction why this book, which was first published in 1999, is perhaps more relevant to our times than ever, offering insights from his experiences of engaging critically with the book with others. As many of you will know, David Austin has appeared on this show before. He's the author of Dread Poetry and Freedom, Linton, Kwesi Johnson, and the Unfinished Revolution, Fear of a Black Nation, Race, Sex, and Security in Sixties, Montreal, and editor of Moving Against the System, the 1968 Congress of Black Writers, and the Making of Global Consciousness. Welcome to you, David. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining the show. David, I suspect you have some questions to ask of Brian.
Yes, you're right to be suspicious. So, full disclosure before we get going. So, Brian Murphy is a friend and somebody I have a great deal of admiration for whom I have a great deal of admiration. I have known him for a very long time. I was actually involved as a board member sitting on the board of the organization Inter Pares, for which Brian worked for many years. And our paths would cross regularly at the summer program of the Concordia, the former summer program, which we'll have a chance to talk about a little bit. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I also wanted to say before I ask the first question, Brian is one of those people, we think about people as they get older, although I still have difficulty believing Brian is the age that he is. That, there's this way we can think about how people get a bit more dangerous with age, right? And Brian is certainly one of those people in the best sense of that word. And so it's a pleasure for me to be here and be engaging in this conversation with Brian. And I'm going to start with a very mundane but I think important question, which is really to ask Brian to talk about why he wrote this book, and maybe a bit about the journey associated with the book. How did this book come into being?
You would think that would be an easy question to answer, but it's that kind of question is almost inevitably ends with a pre-cooked answer, a narrative that doesn't capture all of the accidents that lead to something happening, including a book happening. My early working life was very, very much focused on adult basic education, literacy, basically doing adult education with people who are marginalized. And at the beginning, working out of the community college system here in Ontario, first in Kitchener-Waterloo, and later, after a brief sojourn in West Africa with CUSO, with Algonquin College. And working, doing that work, adult basic education, literacy, working with immigrants and refugees, inevitably took me into working within the context that they lived. And as that was happening, I also then came across the work of Paulo Freire. I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, but I came across Freire and studied him very intensely, looking not for his political theory, but for clues about how to work with the populations that I was working with, and especially in terms of doing that work in their own specific context and not in the institutions. And in so doing, of course, I became much more involved in social animation, in organizing, first out of the community development section of Algonquin College, and then moving to Inter Pares, which, although many people think of it as an international social justice organization, has always been very, very involved, directly involved in the social dynamics of Canada itself, and not only internationally. And inevitably out of that came a preoccupation with knowledge. And at one point in the book, in fact, I say the most important question we can ask ourselves is, how do we know? That may seem on the surface a very simple question, but when you delve into it, it's a mystery in a way. And it wasn't just how we know, but it's how we know what we know that moves us to action or doesn't. In fact, it impedes action. And it was that problem as a social animator, as an activist, as an organizer, around organizing people, motivating them to move, the dilemmas around creating movement. I don't mean movement with a capital M, but movement of momentum within a group, within a population, became a question in my mind that I first started to explore, not with any intention of writing a book. I just started to work on it. And that project started, it did become a manuscript, but I got involved in other things. That is, doing the work I was doing and not writing, not studying, not being a scholar. And years later, as you mentioned, the Concordia Institute in Community Development at Concordia University in Montreal, for people who are outside of Canada. And I started, we were doing seminars every summer with activists around a lot of the things that I'd examined in the manuscript, which was now sitting somewhere. I know you've had times, David, when you've had manuscripts sitting there that are now stunning books. And I used some of that material that I'd written about in the summer program, and it kind of came alive, and people started suggesting maybe I should pull this together. And with a lot of help, it got pulled together, and here we are. And it very much came from this question: how do we know what we know? What is the relationship between knowledge and action?
So that's an important, in fact, central question, which I think we should come back to. and talk about how you explore that in your work. But I also want to, I think it would be good for us to kind of explore some of the other experiences that have shaped this book and have also shaped you, because in many respects, reading this book so many years later, there's a undercurrent of autobiography to this book. And there's a part in the book where you very explicitly talk about an experience that seems to have had a huge impact on your outlook in terms of how you understand, how we think about social change processes and how we understand change, and even how we think about crisis. And it's tied to 3 generations of women that you encountered in El Salvador at a moment when El Salvador was in the midst of this, a tremendous crisis. So could you read from that passage? You have that in front of you?
I have the book here. I'm glad you warned me that you might be asking me to do this. It's interesting, this particular story. Some of our listeners who may have read the book probably already know what that story is. When I've been asked to do readings or seminars around the book, almost inevitably, someone asked me to read this story. It resonated. It's resonated with readers of the book in a way that I find fascinating. And this is how it goes. I was in Salvador in the mid-1980s, one of many, many visits I made to that country during its terrible civil war, visits that brought me to the edge of hope and faith in humanity. I traveled often in the countryside across the invisible lines that mark the zones controlled by the army and guerrilla forces of the FMLN, faced continuously with the tragedy of the struggle and the violence that the people suffered. It was very easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer inhumanity of it and the seeming hopelessness of the cause. One day I was in a small asentamiento, a settlement for displaced people whose agricultural projects we were supporting. We were walking about and came across a family of women in the humble abode of adobe and straw. It was early evening and the sun was setting on this little group. An old woman who might easily have been 100, her daughter almost 70, her daughter, the old woman's granddaughter, who was in her mid-30s, and a teenage girl about 16, a new generation. A mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, and a great-granddaughter, 4 generations of struggle in one circle. I must have looked very, very serious and humorless, because the women laughed and chided me and asked me why I was visiting them if I had nothing to say. Then the old woman told me that I should relax and enjoy the evening with them and stop my frowning. Don't feel sorry for us, she said. We are alive and we will survive. You are welcome to be with us, but only if you can enjoy our place with us and see there something to celebrate in our simple lives. Are you happy? She asked. I responded that I didn't think so. What was there to be happy about? She replied that if she had what I had, she would be very happy and would enjoy it every day. Do not be ashamed of what you have, she said. Enjoy it. That is what you owe to us, to enjoy, and then to share your joy with us. We do not need your sadness or your shame. We had quite a conversation then about home and family and children and the war and the struggle. But the beginning of the conversation will always be with me as a gift, a lesson offered to me who had so much from an old woman who had so little, but who had more to give than I could have imagined until I met her. From that day, I was pledged, whenever I felt despair, to defeat it with a celebration of the life I had and the courage to be and to live that she had shown me. Her gift was a gift of life. This is the meaning of struggle, and if we have the wisdom and the will, we can sustain each other by celebrating ourselves and the struggle, personal and political, that defines our being in our lives. I don't know whether you intended it to be quite that long, but there you go.
No, it's it's such a poignant and wonderful passage that it in so many ways speaks for itself. But I do want to ask you to say a bit more about how that experience influenced and shaped you, even though you've just sort of alluded to it. Mm-hmm.
I guess because as I had that experience, of course, there was a recognition, a recognition, a re-knowing of myself, of where I was. She brought me to where I really was, and not to some dramatic situation of war and refugees and whatever. I've often been interested in the fact that the story resonates so much with folks who read the book or hear it. And I think one of the conclusions I've come to is because they recognize themselves. It's not new knowledge. It's a recuperation of knowledge. It's a striking of energy into an authenticity. But it also is very important in terms of the methodology of organizing, of engaging with people in their own struggle, in returning to the inductive sensibility, attention to subjectivities, very much throughout the book. I try to focus in on the not only the subjective nature of knowledge, but the engagement with the subjectivities from which that knowledge comes from. Not to go from the abstract and apply it to the particular, but whatever abstracts we dare create, we ensure that they emerge from the subjectivities, the intimate, personal, real realities that people live. And when you read that story, that was a very wise woman.
Mm-hmm. Very clear, and she was very clear and direct and profound and simple.
Yeah.
At the same time.
I think she'd seen more than me wandering through her little village, looking the way I did. And I really am grateful for her tolerance and generosity.
But do you think it says something also about the meaning of happiness and where we find it, even in the midst of madness sometimes?
That's an interesting one. I've been very lucky in my work to have been so rooted in Canadian society and in social change activism in Canada. And also at one and the same time to be doing that work at a slightly different level, a supportive level, internationally. Most particularly in Latin America, originally Central America, and then in Colombia and Peru, but also in Africa and Asia, and through the experiences of my colleagues at Paris. I've spent a lot of time in the presence with and engaged with people in struggle. My kids, when they were very young, often weren't very happy that I was away, that I was doing things in places where they saw on the news what was going on, and they asked me as young people, why don't you just stay home? Why do you want to be out there in that world that's so dangerous, that scared them? And I explained to them that actually I didn't really experience predominantly when I come home, what I came home with was not the experience of terror and cruelty. What I came home with was the remarkable courage and, in many ways, joy in the sense that of people engaged in struggle. There wasn't a day that would go by visiting communities, staying in communities, sleeping in the hammock, when actually the day wasn't dominated by laughter, by song, by shared meals, by stories, and a hardbound conviction that things can be transcended. I don't know if that gets to what you were talking about in terms of joy.
No,
in the book, of course, one of the essential points I make is, in fact, most of our action is not out of altruism, of concern for other, especially authentic action. The most authentic action and effective action is action we take on behalf of our own spirit, of our own soul, of our own need for sanity and engagement, regardless of the outcome. And from that action comes joy.
You know, well, there's so many things that I suspect we're just going to run out of time, because there are so many things that we can talk about here. And just to go back a little bit, you know, you talked about, so in recounting an experience that's tied to its experience that you had, which is tied to experience in El Salvador and tied to the overall work that you've been doing. You talked about the relationship between those experiences and theory, right? And the kind of organic relationship between theory and practice and experience. Can you say a bit more about, well, let me put it this way. So some folks might say, as you know, that the book is really theoretical, or quote unquote too theoretical. What do you think about that? What's your reaction to that?
It's interesting because in many ways in my practice and working with others, I've been very wary of theory. Because once theory becomes theory with a capital T, it tends to overwhelm the whole process of knowledge creation, especially from those subjectivities about whom people theorize. So your question about theory in social action and in politics is critical, because our inclination to start with the abstract, to kind of invent a structure through which to interpret reality, and then apply it methodically to extract, in a way, from the circumstances on the ground of real lives of people, can obscure, can stop the very, very process of knowledge creation, and especially knowledge creation as it can be applied to transform the reality that is being known. I've often wondered which part of my book is theoretical, because I feel what it tries to do is describe in quite a phenomenological way what we experience as persons, dealing with the dilemmas of action, even the dilemmas of behavior, and why it seems so difficult to act on what we know, and especially to act on what we know with others, which means engaging with others to create co-knowledge, which is part of the notion of co-conspirator, and the notion of conspiracy, which, as I relate in the book, conspiracy comes from two words that have to do with spirit. To conspire is to bring our breathing together, our breathing of life, our living together. We need theory. Of course we need theory. It's an important tool. But theory should not drive our action or our knowing. It should be a tool used with not caution, but due diligence.
I guess one of the things, that I appreciate about your book in relation to theory, and I imagine, I suspect in some ways it's part of what I attempt to do when I'm thinking and writing also is to take theory. Theory becomes a means through which we can step back and step outside of experience also, to be able to look back at it. In other words, it allows us to be in the midst of something, but also to kind of almost abstract ourselves from it in order to look at it. But the only way that the abstraction takes place is because we're already in it. Otherwise, as you're suggesting, it's kind of an inorganic process. But you suggest the same thing actually about art, including poetry, but about art in general. Can you say a bit about the importance of art in terms of your own perspective and worldview and how it's associated with your work, and even how you conceptualize art?
That's a tricky one, especially talking to you, because in fact, in your writing, in some ways, you have explained and demonstrated what I tried to get at it in the book better than I did in the book. And I know it's one of the things that originally connected you and I. Your recognition of the significance of what I was trying to say in the book. Mm-hmm. And of course, when I talk about art in the book, and I say this, I'm really talking about culture. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about art with a capital A. I'm not talking about artifacts that are objects that then are observed. I'm talking about a process of art, which is a process of imagination. And because the central problematic of the book is how do we know, and how do we know in such a way to lead to humane and sane action. The role of imagination is absolutely key. One of the problems with theory is often theory becomes so reified that it does not allow you to dare to imagine, and even to speak an imagined thought that is a little contrary or to the edge of a theory can cause extreme isolation. As theory gets defends itself. And so imagination is so key. And if we ask the question, how do we know? The question, how do we imagine, is even greater. Although it's more fun because it demands imagination even to imagine how we can imagine. And most of that imagining first happens on the very edge of society, in the cultural community, in the cultural action through art. Obviously through poetry and prose and theater and whatever, performative arts, but also in things like sculpture and whatever. But then when you move down that and look at if art exists like that, then part of our essence is to be an artist. Part of our very nature as activists, as engaged people, is as artists. Not those people over there who are the artists. Not you and me because we've written books. Everyone is an artist. In carpentry, in agriculture, in everything they do, they are imagining what isn't, but what could be. And in that sense, it's very personal. Then there's a transformative thing when people have an urge and live in a way that they are allowed. They have an urge to share their imagining. And that imagining becomes co-imagining. And again, your question around theory, often we live in environments where we have to keep what we imagine secret. We can't imagine that because to share that imagining somehow is threatening. So the process of co-imagination, of sharing what we imagine, giving impulse to the imagination, all of that is art. And when you look back then at some of the wonderful art that we love, that inspires us, that we can return to again and again and again, your book on Kwesi Johnson, it's a perfect example of that as you wind in a spiral way. What he takes from his life and where he lives and imagining, sharing that imagination, and it comes back. It's absolutely crucial. I may have, if I had met you before, put more emphasis on that in the book. I think it's enough. I think people see it. But I think your question is so central to how we move forward with not optimism, but hope. You're onto something around that particular element of the book.
Well, it sounds like, I've always understood the book as being about being and becoming, right? And the space in between those two things. So where we are, existence, and what can be, and what we can become, and what we can make of the world. And that's it's in that space where creativity and imagination becomes so central and important.
And it's a lesson for those of us who are lifelong activists, leaders in activism, are part of movements, to ensure that in our processes, in our practice, we do not behave in ways that inhibit imagination, inhibit the unthinkable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, tied to your sort of theoretical, and it's not even the right way to put it, because then you almost make it abstract by calling it your theoretical approach, but you do have a pedagogical approach, right? And a way you understand how folks work with other folks, which is tied to, your background in teaching and being an educator, and which is very much tied to Paulo Freire, who you mentioned him earlier. But could you talk a bit more about Paulo Freire's impact on you in terms of how you understand the educational process? And of course, when we're talking about education, we're not talking about necessarily inside a classroom, but it's about a way of working together.
That's really central. And it was a long road of learning and practice, some of which really blossomed within the summer program for activism at Concordia, where you and I were both engaged. As I said, I wasn't so much interested in Freire's politics, his political analysis, which is shared by many in the Marxist tradition, but his methodology was beyond radical, in that he literally started his curriculum with the persons with whom he was working. He brought no content to that. Those people were the content. And therefore, he had to imagine a process that could begin with that experience not yet articulated. And that's where the literacy process began. What is literacy other than articulation, participation? Actually, it's participation first, and then articulation of that participation. And so often Freire's methodology, in fact, has been betrayed by people with an ideological agenda who actually brought theory that they felt in conscientization, they would help the people absorb, which is a betrayal of Freire's original intent in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That influenced me greatly. It later influenced the methodology at Paris, which, as you know, has always been very, very inductive, starting with where we are and articulating it in all senses of that word, articulate. And eventually that became the creation of there's a section in the book where I talk about learning circles and what a learning circle is, which was a place where people would gather with what we would call an open agenda. Often the most difficult part of the organizing is trying to get people into a room without telling them what we were going to do, what we were going to talk about, what we were going to solve, because the process was to start with us and not with them, not with that, but to start with us and emerging together with what concerned us and what we were doing. Freire was a great influence on me on that methodological level. And a lot of people, there's the whole notion of open space was predicted by Freire long before it was turned into a technology by corporations.
It reminds me a lot, Freire's approach reminds me a lot of what was referred to in the Jamaican context back in the 60s, for which Walter Rodney was a part of these grounding sessions, like where you kind of ground, which is to say you meet people where they are, and it becomes a dialogue, it becomes a conversation, which the person who's the presumed intellectual probably ends up learning more than she or he shares, than the person shares, because there's a dynamic in between the folks, the interlocutors, in terms of, or what Fanon refers to as this relationship of mutual enlightenment and enrichment. Right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't foreclose the relationship, the role that somebody who, the quote unquote educated person can play, but it doesn't centralize it either. Mm-hmm. And I've always kind of understood the way you approach Paulo Freire in similar ways. But then it raises this question, which you have a very novel way of talking about the role of the individual and individualism, which at a first glance might surprise people. It's the emphasis on the individual in relation to the collective. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because, in sort of activist political circles, like there's we tend to shift away from this conception of the individual, right? And emphasize the collective in a very particular way. But I think for you, the individual as part of the collective is actually quite central. And of course, the individual cannot exist without the collective and vice versa.
That's a critical question. And when it was suggested that we republish this book in the second edition, I wasn't sure. It's out there, people have used it. It was there. And so I reread it, which I hadn't done in some time. And times have changed. And I was kind of intrigued that I had never been criticized, formally criticized, for exactly the element that you're talking about, the focus on the self, on the individual, and Fromm's notion of radical humanism, beginning with the person and then extending. I still believe it's critical. I wouldn't change a word of it. But within the discourse today around communalism, around the ideology of individualism within the Western tradition, within capitalism and all, that the book was kind of exposed by the emphasis that you just revealed. I think the reason it hasn't been critiqued in that regard is because the way I conceive it myself, somewhat like the way you were just talking, it's not, the binary is false. And I do not, and we do not have to be trapped within the notion of self and individual as it evolved in the Enlightenment. We don't have to be trapped into a binary that says we must choose one or the other. And what I tried to do in the book, every reader has to judge for themselves, is to transcend that binary, to transcend that dichotomy, and in a way embrace our selfhood, to embrace the psychosocial reality that we are persons, individuals within an ecology, not only of persons, but without getting into the broader notion of ecology, an ecology of individuals, of persons struggling with the mystery of life, between whatever, hanging between. And it's one of the reasons that I get into in the book a whole chapter on our assumptions about natural law, about what is the nature of our contingencies. And the emphasis on self and the notion of conspiracy is, if there's any contingency, is that ourselves are connected. And to lose those selves is, in fact, to lose the connection, and something else emerges, often not very nice.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you mention natural law, which of course invokes science and ecosystems, the environment, it kind of brings to mind a book that we both have read, independently and without even realizing until we spoke a couple of months back, and that's Stuart Kaufman's At Home in the Universe. Like, what attracted you to that book, and what is it you take from that book in terms of thinking about, ecosystems, the universe, and how we're interconnected?
I read the book actually after I had written the first version of Transforming Ourselves. By that time, there was much more interest in a discourse around systems and systems approaches to transformative action. And I was struck in my own work, even at the Institute, by a block to our imagination, by a whole network of assumptions about what is. And time, space, reality, that made it almost impossible to get past fatalism. The notion is, no matter what we do, there are so many elements at play that there's not very much we can do. And in Kaufman's book, and others that are related to the theme that came out at about the same time, there's an attempt to place life, but all life, in fact, in a sphere where we interact with the fatalism of this bizarre, unimaginable universe, that we can engage as creative, imaginative entities to at least be in it in a live sense, and also maybe even to be one of the elements, one of the variables that move that universe forward. And that our significance is not in what we achieve in that regard, but that we are aware of that potential and behave, live as though we are universal rather than mere objects of that universe. Now if that's not abstraction, I guess.
It's just a reminder also, I guess, that, you know, which is, I think, part of what you're getting at, and tied to what you're getting, is that we're just these small particulars in this broad universe, right? And, you know, when we think about the universe and it's all of its immensity and totality, you know, and also its longevity, you know, the moments that we're in are in some respect not insignificant, clearly, but because we're living and breathing in it, or in them, but that they're also fleeting in some ways. And there's a degree of, we put it, kind of spontaneity, and therefore unpredictability that we can't account for, which allows for possibilities, maybe.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the significance and insignificance are unified. So it is our very insignificance in that beyond imagining universe that is significant because we're still here, and in that sense we are significant as the universe itself. And how we interact, but that isn't true no matter what. It's only true if we know it and act on it and say that is what we wish to be universal together.
Well, just appear to remind us that we're not alone.
No, well, I just wondered whether I might like to make a comment here. I mean, I note Brian's aversion to capital T, capital A, and so on in theory and art. But it seems to me that much of this book is about epistemology, but how do we know what we know? And in that sense, it's not so much theoretical as philosophical, with a capital P, if you like. But I think that we have to be careful. I mean, I just recall a recent essay by Lewis Gordon in which he writes, "I recall an amusing exchange from my years as a graduate student. Discovering I was studying philosophy, a community activist remarked that she had no time for abstractions. She said, 'I prefer to focus on the concrete.' I replied," says Lewis, "you do realize the concrete is an abstract, no?" I think it's something worth keeping in mind. The other thing I want to ask Brian to comment on, and it relates to the aspects of your introduction to the second edition, David, is that the original version had very few references from philosophers from the global South, and I just wonder if you could help us understand why you chose that particular pathway.
In the actual original book, which of course the second edition is the original book. The agreement Feroz and I had to come to is I would not change a word, because that would have been way beyond me. David and I have talked about this. I'm not sure that I made a choice. The process was very organic. It had emerged out of my own practice and struggle, and it happened within a tradition. That tradition was Western. It was home. And it was around adult education, which is, of course, how Prairie did it. And it was never a project to write a book. It was never a project to create a fulsome and adequate discourse. In a way that David talked about the book being semi-biographical. In a way, the way the philosophy, as you call it, for us, emerged is the way my practice did. And by the time the actual words were pulled out of a drawer at Concordia, when I started to use it in those sessions, it was very much around practice. I think in many ways, many of those thinkers were in my consciousness. I remember reading Wretched of the Earth in 1968 when I lived in West Africa, and it emerged in its translation. And in my work, of course, internationally, I was aware of some of this stuff, but not discursively. Is the book weaker for it? I think one of the conclusions David and I came to is the dialogue amongst traditions is so important right now. A rebalancing, but more than a rebalancing, it's not symbolic. It's it's not even an integration. It's the engagement in dialogue of various traditions, and not necessarily the conclusive theories, but the traditions that have led and are leading to the various conversations that are being had. In a recent interview that you and David did around racial capitalism, David had an interesting interaction about the Caribbean Black tradition of theory, as opposed to merely the Africanist or Afro-American or whatever. He's written as well in one of his books the importance of how bringing all of these things together not only enriches, it doesn't kind of even the table. It's absolutely necessary for discourse, for theory making, and especially conspiracy amongst. I guess that's where my reflection has gone since David first raised the question in writing his introduction. It's been very useful for me.
You mentioned Nigeria, and I know in some of your other work, you drawing on fiction and the thing about the theme of creativity, you draw on Chinua Achebe. Can you say a little bit about that?
Chinua Achebe and others, Okri, whatever.
Ben Okri.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a question about the role of, maybe it's not even so much because they're from the African continent, Nigeria, whatever the case may be, but maybe it's more tied to the question of, creativity and fiction and the way that, prose, creative writing can sort of create spaces that maybe more so-called scientific writing, which is a very, just it doesn't enter that space the same way.
In the case of some of the Nigerian writers, my affinity, of course, comes from my affinity with Nigeria. If you live in a place, you never forget it. And I was a very young person. It influenced me a lot. But in some of those writers, in particular, it was the primacy of the stories. The stories were so intimate. They weren't metaphorical. They weren't allegories. They were intimate descriptions of the lives people were leading, and it's that primacy that I think is important. And such traditions, such writing comes from all over the place. Also, interestingly, the influence of Eduardo Galeano and his aphoristic kind of writing, where he dared to lightly dance on our consciousness in such a way that what we knew had to come out. He didn't assume he had to tell us. He sparked, he inspired, he drew forth. So in the book, especially in the epilogue, a lot of the notations I make, they come from literature. And although they almost seem like philosophical statements, they were part of the story.
Rose, did you have another question before I ask?
No. Please go ahead.
This is. I'm not even sure if it's the right question to ask, but where are we today? When we think about your book was written, what's
99?
Well, so it's over 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And where
it existed before that, so the words are probably 30 years.
And we're in a very different, but quite familiar moment, right, in terms of where things are in the world. And, the idea of republishing this book was precisely because, despite the passage of time, there are so many things, so many parts of the book that still speak to our moment. And you're constantly reflecting on where we are in the world. You have this historic email list in which you send out all kinds of information that you're not just sort of a clearinghouse for this information, but you're thinking about these questions too. How do you, what sense do you make of our moment? Like, what's your thoughts on where we are in the here and now?
Cool. It's a big question.
It is. I realize it is. And it's a very open-ended and even abstract question too.
I speak a bit about it. I touch a bit of it in my afterword, as you know. And in the Radical Road distribution list that you were referring to, radicalroad.com, that I send it out on, I've often been asked why I don't do more commentary at the beginning of the pieces that I send out. I try to send out pieces that don't need commentary. They are an interaction with people who wish to read them. But also, virtually anything that goes out, no matter how good, has limits. And I, in a way, don't want to take sides. But we live at a time where, for a number of reasons, the impulse is to take sides rather than to find the theme that bring people together, not in a reconciliatory way, but in a way that bounds us forward to new ways to imagine. Part of it, I think, is technology. When I wrote this book, when the first words came out, I didn't have a computer. It was written, and you may be amazed. I wrote it with a pencil and a cigarette. I don't use either anymore. So technologically, the cybernetics of activism today, cybernetic feedback systems, that's what cybernetics is about, feedback systems. They're very, very complex, and have many elements that are positive, but also many elements that are vicious, are undermining of social solidarity, and almost inevitably focus on binaries, on false dichotomies, imposed dichotomies, and also with a risk of activism becoming virtual. So that in my book, in our conversation, this notion between the inductive and the deductive is so important, that I originally drew from Paulo Freire, that you starting there, from the ground up. And with social media and virtual activism, the connection between the ground, real, live human beings in their moment of struggle, their moments of joy, is lost. There is no articulation. And those who control social media, and there's all sorts of elements that give people power in social media, and very little accountability. It has to do with technique, affluence, skill. The line between the essentialization of fact, of people in struggle, and those actual living human beings is lost. And they're, I don't think even it is within the technology to re-articulate that. Does that mean we have to go back? No, we actually can't. So there's no question why theorize about should we go back. But I think it's something that should be grappled with. If we had 3 hours, I could come up with other things that have changed since I wrote the book. Me, I hope, has also changed, and you guys, and the people that are reading it. But I think that the question you just asked is one that should engage every serious activist, every movement, as they become reified in the new technology and the new power structure. Because we've got a long way to go. And if it is controlled by the technology, and who knows how that's going to evolve, I fear it also puts us under surveillance, which is another issue entirely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So where are we, Feroz?
Well, I think we're coming up to the hour, and as you say, Brian, I mean, we could be talking here for a few hours, if not days, on this. So let's commit ourselves to continuing these conversations in another forum. But for the moment, I'd just like to say thank you, Brian, for joining us and telling us about this important book, Transforming Ourselves, Transforming the World. David, thank you for inspiring this conversation with Brian. And so please don't go. We will end the broadcast shortly, and we can have a quick conversation afterwards. So to all of those who have been watching today, thank you very much for joining us. Please feel free to visit the Daraja Press website, darajapress.com, where you can get a copy of this book, or indeed download a free PDF of it. So this is Feroz Manji signing off for today, and thank you for this conversation on an open conspiracy for social change.